The mountain man was about to send her away. His daughter whispered, "Daddy, that's her." The axe hit wrong. Not the split that was clean, poplar going apart like it wanted to, but the landing. My right knee folded sideways when I stepped off the stump, and the whole stack I'd built that morning went over in the snow, and I stood there breathing hard, looking at the mess. 43 years old with a knee that had been broken twice and healed stupid both times. Steam coming off the logs in the cold. That was the morning she arrived. I didn't know that then. I only knew my knee hurt, the wood needed to be restacked, and Nora was inside with a fever that had started 2 days before and wasn't moving. 7 years old, my daughter. 7 years old, and the nearest doctor was 4 hours south if the pass was clear, which it wasn't. I'd gone up to check it the previous afternoon. 2 feet of new snow in the Narrows and still coming. I restacked the wood. Every time I bent down, I could feel the knee grinding where it shouldn't. I carried the bigger rounds instead of bending for the smaller splits because the smaller splits meant getting low, and getting low meant coming back up, and coming back up meant that sound. Like a green branch that doesn't quite break. I've made myself deaf to a lot of things in 12 years up here. That sound I can't make myself deaf to. When I came back inside, Nora was sitting up. Not better, just up. She had her mother's quilt pulled around her, and she was sitting at the edge of her bed looking at the window the way she sometimes does, like she's listening for something specific. Her face was still hot when I pressed my wrist to her forehead. She let me do it, which meant she was still sick, because when Nora's well, she doesn't hold still for anything. "You need water," I said. "I need Mama," she said. She'd said it before. Most children who lose their mother say it when they're sick or scared, and I'd stopped flinching at it the 2nd or 3rd year. Or I'd told myself I had. I poured the water. I put it in her hands and waited until I was sure she'd drink it before I went back outside to finish the wood. That's how I was managing things. She came around the east side of the cabin on a horse that looked like it had been through a week of bad ideas. Gray mare, thin across the hips, one ear cocked wrong from the cold. The woman on its back was sitting straight but holding the saddle horn, which told me her legs had stopped trusting her. She was wearing a coat that was good quality but not mountain quality. City quality. The kind of coat that works fine until the elevation gets above 5,000 feet and the wind decides to have an opinion. I was splitting again. I'd gotten the knee worked out enough to split again, or told myself I had. She stopped the horse about 20 feet out and looked at me without saying anything for a moment. Snow was coming sideways, and she had ice in her hair where it came out under her hat. "I came up from Ridgeline," she said. "My guide turned back at the lower fork when the weather changed. He said there was shelter up the mountain." She paused. "He said you were here." "He say I was friendly." "He said you were here." I looked at her, she looked back. There was nothing desperate in her face, which I noticed. Most people who show up at a mountain cabin in a sideways snow have desperate in their face. She just looked tired and honest about it. "Get down," I said. "I'll see to the horse." Her name was Cecilia Bright. She'd come from St. Louis by wagon train, which she said without drama, the way you say you came from somewhere when the getting here was hard but you don't need credit for it. She was a school teacher. There'd been a position offered by a settlement 3 days' ride south called Bramer, new town, new school. They'd sent for a teacher in the spring, and she'd answered. She was 28. She told me all of this while I hung her coat by the stove, and she stood with her back to it, still in her riding clothes, getting some feeling back into her hands. I told her she could stay until the pass opened, maybe 2 days if the snow stopped, maybe 4 if it didn't. She said that was fine. She didn't ask about my wife, didn't ask why I was up here alone. Didn't comment on the cabin or the way I'd organized it or the way I hadn't. She just looked around once, quietly, and then she went and sat at the table and took off her boots to check her feet, because a woman who's been riding in mountain cold knows to check her feet. They were fine, a little pale at the toes, but fine. I was watching her do this, and then I wasn't watching, because I'd gotten out of the habit of watching women do ordinary things. You live alone long enough, ordinary things become private things, and private things belonging to someone else make you feel like you've trespassed somewhere. I went and checked on Nora. She was asleep, better sleep than the morning, slower with her mouth open, the fever still there but not climbing. I stood in the doorway a moment, and then I heard Cecilia behind me, quiet on the plank floor, and I started to say something about not coming in, about the girl being sick. But she was already looking past me at Nora's sleeping face, and she said, so low it barely carried. How long has she been feverish? 2 days. Coughing. Some. She nodded, didn't push further. Just looked at Nora for another moment with an expression I can't describe exactly. Not pity, nothing soft about it, more like she was thinking and the thinking had a weight to it. Then she went back to the main room. That night I slept in the chair by Nora's bed, which was where I'd been sleeping since the fever started. I had the door open a few inches so the stove heat could reach, and sometime in the dark hours I heard Cecilia get up, heard the careful sound of her moving around, heard the stove lid lifted and wood put on. She didn't come to the door. She just stoked the fire and went back to her bedroll on the bench. I thought about that for a while. A woman who stokes the fire at 3 in the morning because a child she doesn't know has a fever and does it without making it anything, without waking the father to let him know she did it. That's a particular kind of person. You don't meet them often. You don't forget them when you do. I'm not saying I knew anything that night. I'm saying I noticed. In the morning, Nora was worse. Not dangerously worse, but worse in the specific way that meant the fever had made its decision to stay, and we were going to have to outlast it. She was awake when I came to her, awake and heavy-eyed and wanting the window open a crack, which I did, and she lay there with the cold air on her face and didn't say much. Cecilia cooked breakfast without asking. Oats, salted, with the dried apple I had in the cellar. She brought a bowl for Nora without being asked, and Nora took it without the usual argument she gives me when she's sick and doesn't want to eat. I watched that. A man notices when his child accepts something from a stranger that she'd refuse from him. You can think a lot of things about what it means. I just watched it and said nothing. We were at the table when Nora called from her room. Not my name, she called for Cecilia. I looked at Cecilia. She looked at me just briefly with something like apology in it. Then she went. I sat there, listened to the low sound of Nora's voice and then Cecilia's, too quiet to make out, going back and forth. A few minutes, then quiet. I got up and looked around the doorframe, and Cecilia was sitting on the edge of the bed, and Nora was describing something with both hands. Some story, some dream, I couldn't tell. And Cecilia was listening the way you listen to a child when you actually care what the child is saying, which is different from the way most adults listen to children, which is really just waiting for them to stop. I went back to the table. There are things a man can feel and not have a name for. I had one of those things sitting in my chest for the rest of that morning. Not grief exactly, not longing exactly, something between them. The snow kept coming. 3 days, then 4. The pass was buried. There was no question of Cecilia leaving, and she stopped asking about it after the second day, which I took to mean she'd made her peace with waiting. She was a practical woman. I could see that in the way she moved through the cabin, not taking over, not being tentative either, just fitting herself into the space in a way that didn't crowd anything. On the 3rd afternoon, I was at the table mending a bridle. The cheek piece had cracked in the cold, and she was reading at the other end. She'd had a book in her saddlebag, small, worn at the spine, and she read the way some people sleep, completely and with her whole attention. I worked the leather and she read, and the stove knocked, and the snow pressed against the south window. "You've been up here a long time," she said, without looking up from the book. 12 years. Your daughter was born here. Born here, her mother died when she was 2. She looked up then, not with pity, which I'd come to expect and never liked, just with her eyes on me. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago." "That doesn't seem to be how grief works," she said, and went back to her book. I sat with that for a while. She wasn't wrong. But no one up here had said a true thing about it to me in 12 years, and I wasn't sure what to do with someone who did. Nora broke fever on the 4th night. I knew it before she woke up, could feel it in the way the air in her room changed, something easier about it, less taut. When she opened her eyes, they were clear. She looked at me in the chair and she said, "I'm hungry," and that was the best sentence I'd heard in a week. Cecilia was up before I could go to the main room. She had the oats already on and the apple, and she'd found the small jar of honey I keep for Nora's bad nights, and she put some in, which Nora took like medicine, eating seriously, sitting up in bed with the bowl in both hands. After Nora had eaten and gone back to sleep, real sleep, healthy sleep, I came out and sat at the table, and Cecilia poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me, and neither of us said anything for a while. She'll be fine, Cecilia said. I know. But it's something else feeling it. Yes, I said. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside, the snow had stopped. I couldn't tell when, but it had stopped, and the silence that had replaced it was a different quality of silence. Morning quiet instead of storm quiet. I'll look at the past tomorrow, I said. She nodded. I looked at her hands on the cup. Capable hands, not soft. A woman who worked for a living and didn't think about that one way or the other. It's a good town, Bramer, I said, though I'd only been through it once 6 years back and I couldn't honestly say. I hope so. Good work for a school teacher. Those new towns always need schools more than they need anything else. Yes, she said. I was telling her to go. I don't know if she heard it that way. I was telling myself she should go, which isn't quite the same thing. She was going anyway. Pass opened or not, she had somewhere to be and a life that had been planned before she turned up at my cabin, and a man with a bad knee and a 7-year-old daughter up a mountain was not a factor in that plan. I knew all of that. I drank the coffee. In the morning, Nora got up on her own. This matters if you know Nora when she's been sick. She doesn't get up on her own. She stays in bed until something interesting happens, and the definition of interesting is narrow. I heard her bare feet on the floor while I was still pulling on my boots, and I went to her doorway, and she was standing at her window in her nightgown looking out at the stopped snow. It stopped, she said. It stopped. She turned and looked at me with her mother's eyes, which she does sometimes when she has something she's decided, and she said, she should stay. I looked at my daughter. Cecilia, Nora said, as if I might have forgotten her name. She should stay here. She's got a school to teach, I said. They can find another teacher. Nora. She's the one, Daddy. Nora said it plain, the way children say things when they're too young to know they're not supposed to say them. I dreamed it. She's the one. I stood in the doorway looking at my 7-year-old daughter who had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of landing on the truth like it was obvious, and everyone else was just slow. I didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say to that. I went and told Cecilia the pass was probably open. She was packed in 20 minutes. That was another thing about her, she didn't fuss. Coat, bag, a quick check of the room to make sure she hadn't left anything. She came out and put her bag by the door, and I had the gray mare saddled in the lean-to. And Nora was sitting at the table still in her nightgown watching everything with those particular eyes. I brought the mare around to the front. Cecilia came out and started to put her foot in the stirrup, and Nora appeared in the doorway, which I hadn't expected because it was cold and she wasn't dressed for it. You should stay, Nora said. Cecilia looked at her, then she looked at me. I don't know what she saw. A man with a bad knee standing in the snow holding a horse, probably not saying anything, which was what I did when I didn't know what to do. That was most of what she'd seen of me for 5 days. A man who restacked his own wood and slept in a chair and didn't ask for help. Because asking for help had been something I'd trained out of myself a long time ago when it turned out there was no one to ask. She left her foot out of the stirrup. Ilias, she said my name. She'd used it maybe twice in 5 days. Is she right? I looked at my daughter in the doorway with no coat and fever pale, and her jaw set like she was prepared to stand there all winter. I looked at Cecilia. I don't know how to ask anyone for anything anymore, I said. It came out plain, the way plain things come out when you stop holding them. I haven't for a long time. I don't know that this. I stopped. Looked at the horse because the horse didn't require anything of me. Nora knows things, I said. She gets that from her mother. She's been right before. Cecilia was quiet. She was looking at me with something I can't name well even now, years later, knowing how it ended. Not pity. Not the look a woman gives a man she's deciding to rescue. Something clearer than that, like she was just seeing me. Whatever I actually was without the story I usually told around it. I have a contract, she said. I know. The school is expecting me. I know. But Bramer isn't the only town that needs a school. She looked out at the pass, at the white country going south. And I suspect you know everyone within 2 days' ride. I did know them. Ridgeline had been trying to get a school going for 3 years and had no teacher. I knew the man who ran the general store there, and I knew the school board he'd been trying to organize. I'd done some work for them once, hauling timber when their mill couldn't get supply. They owed me a favor they'd been carrying a long time. I said so. Cecilia looked at Nora. Nora looked at Cecilia. You'd be beholden to no one, I said. Ridgeline pays its people. It's a real town, not a camp. You'd have a salary and a house. And you, she said. And me, I said, if you think that's worth something. She was quiet another moment, long enough that I started telling myself I'd said too much. Then she turned and put her bag down in the snow and came toward me and stopped about 2 feet away and looked at me the way she'd looked at Nora those mornings in the sick room, like what she was seeing mattered, and she was going to make sure she was seeing it right. She put her hand on my chest, flat, like she was checking something, like she was making sure I was real. It's worth something, she said. I put my hand over hers. I don't know when I decided to do that. I think my hand just knew. Nora made a sound behind us that wasn't quite a cheer and wasn't quite a word. Something between the two. I didn't look at her. I just stood there in the snow with Cecilia's hand on my chest and my hand on hers, and something I hadn't felt in 12 years started moving inside me like a river under ice when the weather finally changes. Not loud, not sudden, just beginning to move. That was March. By April, I'd written to Gerald Foss at the Ridgeline store, and Gerald had written back in 5 days flat, which told me how badly they wanted a teacher. By May, they had the school building framed. Cecilia wrote to Bramer, explained the situation, and they found another woman in Missouri who made the trip. Life continued to be built. Cecilia moved into the Ridgeline boarding house in June, which was right and proper, and I rode down twice a week, which was more than right and proper, but no one in Ridgeline said anything because they knew me and they knew that twice a week was as close to declaring myself as a man like me was going to manage without being pushed. Nora came with me always. She liked the school, liked the smell of the chalk dust and the rows of primers. She'd sometimes sit in on the afternoon lessons, which Cecilia allowed, and I'd stand at the back with my hat in my hands watching my daughter read aloud to a room of children who were 3 years older than her, reading clearly and without stumbling because her mother had taught her young, and because she was Nora and she did everything completely. I asked Cecilia to marry me in September, on the porch of the boarding house at dusk when the mountains were going purple and the first cold had just come back into the air. I didn't have a speech. I had the question, and I had my hat, and I had 12 years of being a man who didn't ask for anything and had finally found one thing worth asking for. She said yes before I finished the sentence. She said she'd been waiting since March. I told her that seemed long. She said some things were worth waiting for, and she looked at me when she said it, and I understood she wasn't only talking about the question. We married in October, small in Ridgeline, with Gerald Foss and his wife and 3 of the school families, and Nora standing beside Cecilia in a dress that had belonged to her mother, which Cecilia had taken in at the seams with a needle and thread, and an afternoon while I was out getting firewood, because she knew without being told that it mattered, and she knew without being told that I wouldn't ask. She knew most things without being told about me. That was something I'd had to get used to, being known, being seen. It's a strange thing after a long time of nobody seeing you. Takes some getting used to. You keep waiting for the moment when what she sees disappoints her. When she looks at the knee, or looks at the years, or looks at the mountain and decides it's too much. I kept waiting for that. She never looked that way. She just looked at me the way Nora had said she would, even before Cecilia knew I existed. Like I was the one she'd been heading toward, the whole long way from St. Louis on a wagon through all that open country, all that sky, all that weather. Like I was the thing at the end of the direction. I don't know how to say what that did to a man who'd been alone 12 years, and had stopped thinking of himself as anything a woman would head toward. What I know is this. That first winter after we married, I didn't sleep in the chair. I slept in a bed, with a woman who had chosen me, in a cabin that smelled like wood smoke and bread, and the particular cold that comes in under the door in January, no matter how well you've stuffed the gap with wool. And some mornings I'd wake before her, and lie there with the gray light starting outside and Nora asleep across the hall and Cecilia's breathing beside me, slow and sure. And I'd think about that gray mare coming around the east side of the cabin in the sideways snow, and that woman sitting straight in the saddle with ice in her hair, and how close I'd come to sending her on. How close? Nora saved me that. My 7-year-old daughter in her nightgown, standing in the cold doorway with her mother's eyes, and her mother's, way of knowing what was true before anyone else had caught up. Daddy, that's her. She was right. She's been right about a lot of things since. Gets it from her mother. Gets it, I think now, from whatever it is that finds its way through the people we love even after they're gone, even when we don't ask for it, even when we're standing in the snow convinced we don't deserve any more than what we already have. The world still has more than we let ourselves believe it does. That's what I know. That's what I carry.